Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure as the next speaker to introduce Werner Liebregts. And Werner is an assistant professor. He is with the University of Tilburg since, if I recall correctly, 2018. And he studied in Tilburg, but he got his PhD at the University of Utrecht. Werner calls himself a quantitative researcher, and it also shows that he is an excellent teacher because he all has these qualifications that we find important, like BKO and SKO in Dutch. What I also found very interesting about you, if I may say so, Werner, in front of the audience, is that you have really a great website of your own. And one of the things that struck me in particular is the fact that we have our talks here, but you contribute to the Z Talks, as it is called, and that is a magazine. And so you collect your columns, you give your opinion there. And I was wondering, just as a start, this capital Z, does it refer to the generation Z or is it something else?
It's actually something else. I think it stands for zelfstandige, so self-employed.
Yes, well, which is good. And also something we hope that the Generation Z will embrace and account for. So please, Werner, we are really looking forward to your presentation. Take it away.
Thank you, Emil. So thank you for this wonderful introduction, and let's move on indeed. So my talk is titled The Promise of Social Signal Processing for Entrepreneurship Research and Education. So let me be clear, I'm an entrepreneurship researcher in a data science institute. As such, I've been looking for ways to connect the disciplines. So what is the intersection of data science and entrepreneurship as disciplines? And one of those topics at the intersection clearly is social signal processing and how it can be used for both entrepreneurship research and not just entrepreneurship education, but education broadly. So not necessarily entrepreneurship education. This will become clear during my talk. So to elaborate a bit more on what I just said, the way data science and entrepreneurship as disciplines intersect, this can be seen in the following two ways, according to me. So first of all, you could ask yourself the question, how can entrepreneurs use data or big data and AI to become successful or even more successful than they are now? And then we're talking about topics like entrepreneurs applying business intelligence, big data analytics. Maybe they do some form of data-driven decision-making, and you can also look into levels of data maturity of those entrepreneurs or the companies that they own and manage. Second, we as entrepreneurship researchers, of course, can also use the latest data science methods and techniques to tackle conventional entrepreneurship research questions in better ways. So you can imagine that we've been using for decades surveys, interviews, manual coding, observations, those kinds of things. And they've brought us far, so don't get me wrong. But I think it's about time to make this switch to the state-of-the-art data science methods and techniques like machine and deep learning methods, but also social signal processing. So it's the latter intersection of the two disciplines that we're talking about here. So what is social signal processing? Well, in short, it's about the automatic detection and analysis of humans' behavioral cues. And for that, I refer to work by Alex Pentland and Alessandro Vincerelli. So that's really seminal work in this field of social signal processing, in which I myself, I'm not a true expert, but that's why I searched for collaboration within JADS for experts in the field. But I do know the basics of the field and, of course, how we can apply those techniques in the entrepreneurship research. So what are examples of social signals? Facial expressions, as can be seen on the right as an example. That's me. Gaze behavior, vocal behavior, gestures, body posture, what have you. So all kinds of non-verbal behavioral cues. So the collaboration that I just mentioned goes back to a couple of years ago. So in 2020, this paper got published in an economics or entrepreneurship journal, which is called Small Business Economics. The paper was titled The Promise of Social Signal Processing for Research on Decision-Making in Entrepreneurial Contexts. So this indeed is the application of SSP in entrepreneurial contexts. And as you can see, some of my co-authors back then were Erik Posma and Martin Atzmüller, also both affiliated to Mind Labs, at least at the time. Martin Atzmüller currently is a professor at Osnabrück University, if I'm correct. And we wrote this conceptual paper that kind of at the core had 5 propositions derived from theory that needed, according to us, further empirical scrutiny. The key takeaways from this paper, it discusses and illustrates the potential value of social signal processing for future research on decision-making. And that's not only decision-making by entrepreneurs, like strategic decisions, hiring decisions, those kinds of things, but it's also about decision-making by others, yet directly affecting those entrepreneurs. For example, by investors deciding whether or not to fund in a certain startup, for example. Well, how can social signal processing help? Well, we contend that it's more accurate and more efficient than conventional research methods. So although a majority of this audience may be very well known to this field of social signal processing, it actually is completely new to the entrepreneurship audience. And on top of that, it may reveal important characteristics that so far have been omitted in explaining decisions that are vital for firm survival and growth. So you can imagine that from the face, you can also read some more unconscious or subtle micro-expressions that cannot be observed by humans, or not as accurately. So this is the conceptual framework that we shared in the paper, and it might seem a bit complex at first glance, but I'll take you through it. On the right-hand side, we have decision making. So there is a certain decision being made in an entrepreneurial context. And of direct influence are, first of all, so let's go from the bottom up, non-behavioral cues like demographics, traits, and competences of the people involved. But we also argue that there is a direct influence of what is being said and done, so verbal and non-verbal behavior, during the interactions of the people involved. And on top, what is being said and done also moderates the relationship between the non-behavioral cues and decision-making. So let's apply this to a particular setting. So you can think of funding decisions by investors in investor pitch settings. So entrepreneurs at some point in time pitch their business ideas in front of investors, and based on that, the investors decide whether or not to fund. So looking at the non-behavioral cues, what is important here? First of all, quality of the idea, the business idea, but also the quality of the people behind the idea, so the idea champions and their demographics, traits, competences, and so on. And that might partly be known beforehand, so before the social interaction takes place. Then the social interaction also has an effect, of course, direct and a moderating effect on the non-behavioral cues, like I said before. In a pitch setting, of course, physical appearance is important, gestures, posture, face and eye behavior, vocal behavior. And over there, you see a strike through space and environment. It might be important, but that is being done because of the particular research context that I'll be talking about in a bit. Of course, what is also important is the verbal behavior, so the contents of the pitch and the answers to questions being asked right after the pitch. So think of a Dragon's Den setting, for example. So what have I done over the past years? I've made use of the professional studio in the Ecosys building of Tilburg University and realized this research setup. So as you can see, not only a camera has been faced to the student entrepreneur, in this case, pitching in the square on the upper right corner of the screen, We've also had 3 cameras faced to the investors sitting on the other side of the table. Well, there were some limitations, so there was only 1 representative per startup. In real life, that may be more. We had limited use of space, so only like the small square, like said before, in the upper right corner of the screen. No slide decks were allowed, no mock-ups or prototypes to demonstrate in a real-life setting were allowed. So those are limitations as compared to Dragon's Den, for example, but that was done for research purposes. This is the way it looked like in real life. So in the studio in the Coasters building of Tilburg University. Here's the output. So these are simultaneously running or completely in sync videos from which we can derive both audio, verbal behavior, and non-verbal behavioral cues, both on the side of the entrepreneur and the investors. So we could, for example, look at mimicry, synchronization of behavior as mechanisms through which, for example, passion on the side of the student entrepreneur is contagious and spreads, and maybe the investors become as passionate as the entrepreneurs about the business idea. Well, after each and every pitch, the investors also filled in an evaluation sheet with all kinds of concepts in it: coachability, preparedness, passion, but also all kinds of potential outcome measures like probability of investment, originality, desirability, feasibility, quality of the idea. So all kinds of judgments regarding the pitch based on the pitch. So back to this. Now you better understand the setting. Funding decision is being made based on the quality of the idea and the quality of the idea champion, the representative of the startup pitching in front of them. But of course, the verbal behavior, so the contents of the pitch and the answers to the questions being asked by them, as well as the non-verbal behavior, clearly has an effect on their ultimate decision to fund, yes or no. So what is an example of social signal processing that can be applied in this particular case? Well, we can look at face and eye behavior, for example, and we have 3 major software tools for that: Effective AFDAX, Emotion Facet, and Face Reader by the Dutch company Nolders, so founded and managed by Lucas Nolders. And they're actually all based on this facial action coding system by Ekman and Friesen, which already goes back to the research in the previous century, the 70s. Which essentially is a method to divide the human face into 46 so-called action units. And although you could derive emotions based on combinations of certain action units, I think we should be careful with doing that, because this might be culturally influenced, for example. So it's mostly better to stick to the facts here and to the actual action units rather than deriving emotions from it. That's tricky. So this is one of those tools that I've just mentioned. So CERT, currently Emotion Facet, but formerly known as CERT, Communication Expression Recognition Toolbox. And here you can see that you can actually run through this software, the videos, and as output you'll get many data points. So I think 24 frames per second, so as many data points as that, on all kinds of action units, as well as, for example, the emotions that we also saw. Well, let me not go into detail, but what we should take from this slide is that Facet might outperform AFDAX and Nolders' Face Reader. However, newer versions are no longer commercially available, or they don't receive updates or support anymore. Hence, we should go with the remaining available software tools, and then we see that Face Reader clearly outperforms AFDAX. At the same time, Face Reader also uses many more facial landmarks, so key identification points on the face. So it seems like that's a good option to use for facial expression detection and analysis. But also keep in mind that comparison of the performance of each of these software tools may be biased, and there also exists a large variance in accuracy across emotions and databases used. So there is some doubt regarding the external validity here. Nonetheless, Face Reader is pretty accurate in detecting and analyzing these social signals from the face. Another example would be vocal behavior, and how can you actually derive that from the audio, from the videos being retrieved. So, which is about the expressive non-content characteristics of speech. So not the verbal content, but things like pitch, tone, tempo, volume. For that, I've set up a collaboration with Paul Boersma, professor of phonetic sciences and well-known for speech signal processing program Praat, but also currently developer at Vocaturi, which claims that the software can understand the emotion in the speaker's voice just as well as concentrated people can, actually. So here it says people can, it's about concentrated people. So it typically performs better than any random person trying to derive emotions from the non-content characteristics of speech. So with this tool, you could also, for example, derive the 6 basic emotions as listed here. And this is what it could look like. So please keep in mind that it's about the non-content characteristics of speech, and simultaneously those characteristics might convey different emotions at the same time. And that's what also can be seen here. So far, I've just shared a few examples of what can be done with social signal processing techniques, face and eye behavior and vocal behavior. But there is much more. There's also a whole lot of open source software, for example, which you can actually analyze posture and gestures, for example, which could also be very useful in such pitch settings. But one can also think of many more applications like board meetings, applications, job applications, for example, those kinds of things. As long as there is social interaction involved and decisions being made by someone involved in the interaction. Now to how it could also be of help in education. So not just entrepreneurship education, but education broadly. So it could be used as a video feedback tool in education. So why would you use video feedback in education? Well, students, as well as us teachers, educators, can actually receive direct feedback from it. So it's already very helpful, you can imagine, if you see yourself back on a recording, on a video, so how you've performed. That holds for me as a teacher, but also for students, for example, being trained in certain skills, like pitch skills. But I believe we can actually enrich the insights being gained from these videos. So not just videotaping their performance and discussing the do's and don'ts in a plenary setting afterwards, but we can actually enrich the data, the insights, by using, for example, again, a tool like FaceReader. There's also something called Viso. That's also a software tool which can actually be combined with FaceReader, with which you can actually give nearly real-time or real-time even feedback to people being recorded in a certain setting. And that is something I see as a next step to further innovate my entrepreneurship education. And who knows, it might also be of help in my entrepreneurship research. Very much looking forward to any of your questions that you might have at the end of the presentations. And I thank you for your attention for now.
Well, thank you very much, Werner. In view of time, I think we have only very little time to take questions. So maybe a very short one that pops up immediately. That would be the question, how do you deal with privacy issues? And this should be applied in, let's say, normal day or everyday life settings.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think it's still pretty hard to actually apply it in real time, yes, in real life settings. But in case of education or for research purposes, you can actually work with informed consent forms. And that is something I've been doing very carefully because... And
what is the attitude of the students? Do they simply like it, as in, I would like to be part of this, so record me and show me my emotion? Or
yeah, so
are they reluctant?
Judging from the informed consent forms, a vast majority actually ticks the box of it's okay to use it for teaching and research purposes. Many are willing to use it in a plenary setting, like in a tutorial the week after, to discuss the do's and don'ts.
Yeah.
And I've been told that it's a real life experience that sticks.
So they put a lot of trust in you as a teacher.
I guess they do. but they can also trust.
That's very good.
So,
yes, I know that.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
You're welcome.